And the purpose is to ensure that new industries coming in are an appropriate distance away from neighborhoods for protection of sensitive uses such as residences, parks, and schools. Of course, to improve our public health and air quality. And we want to provide appropriate locations for batch plant operations as well, because we know that they're necessary. We want to provide for these industries as well. So this is just a photo of a batch plant, and with the parts of the equipment that are on site for a typical batch plant. And then I have an aerial diagram here. You can get a good idea of what the elements are to a batch plant. Another one in Dallas, of course, and here you can see, we do have some of these batch plants that are fairly close to residential. Another one here is near Joppy. I'm sorry. Take that back. I'm sorry. I was ahead of myself. This is the batch plant that's near the Joppy area. And I apologize. I'm trying to move through this fairly quickly, the background, and for the purpose of those who are just joining us for the first time, trying to go over the background of where we've been and where we are now. Two-phased approach again it was recommended and put into place to address the urgency of the sensitive land use issues. We knew that the overall code amendment would take quite some time to develop and have to do a comprehensive approach and good analysis. So as an interim, we did a phase one short-term approach to immediately address the lack of the public process. And so we removed the administrative by right approval process for the temporary batch plants. And so the result of that was that all batch plants, whether temporary or permanent, are required to have a specific use permit or SUP, which is a zoning process with public hearings at CPC, City Plan Commission, and City Council. So we're here now at phase two. We have the draft new regulations, and again, that was through a comprehensive review and public input. We had the public input meetings previously, which we'll see in a minute, and before we got to work on phase two to get a lot of public input on the concerns and and feedback suggestions. So we've done a lot of internal departmental coordination and coordinated with industries. So I just have the dates here of the different meetings that we've already held. We've got some future meetings as well. And probably, I believe they're this week and maybe beginning of next week with some of our industries as well. And of course, we've had a lot of, and we're still coordinating with all of our internal departments. There's a lot of departments that are involved, of course, in the zoning process. And so we've coordinated with the current planning, building inspection, our OEQS, which is our environmental quality department, code compliance, stormwater management, public works, transportation, and others, of course. So again, that's still ongoing. We did develop an internal checklist, and that won't be codified through our draft regulations, but it's an internal process that we will have during our zoning application intake that will help with compliance for the regulations. So getting into the meat of it, we have what has come up mainly out of these public meetings was the appropriate distances from concrete or asphalt batch plants to residential, public schools, and public parks. So a lot of the issues that came out of the previous meetings on phase two for input, we heard that batch plants were located next to residential including multifamily, and, a lot of compatibility issues with respect to that. And so some suggestions were batch plants should not be allowed in residential neighborhoods. Our draft recommendations or regulations that we're going to, after input and doing a little bit more work, we'll bring to our zoning ordinance advisory committee, and then of course city plan commission, and then finally city council before any results or before a final ordinance is adopted. That's what I'll be going through on these slides, what we heard from the public, what the public suggestions were, and then what we felt, what the draft recommendations are that address these issues. So I'm just trying to show alignment in this format. So permanent batch plants are only allowed in IM, Industrial Manufacturing District, with an approved specific use permit. So of course, permanent batch plants are not allowed in residential. We'll continue to unfold that, but temporary batch plants are only allowed in residential districts if the plant is serving construction or partial reconstruction of a residential site, or with an approved SUP if it's a temporary off-site batch plant. And we'll go over that a little bit more too. There's different subcategories for the temporary batch plants, as well as permanent. So permanent or temporary batch plants are only allowed in special districts, a walkable mixed use, or walkable residential or residential transition, historic overlay, or new PDs with an approved SUP. They won't be allowed by right in these districts. Other issues or feedback we heard: kids are playing at the soccer complex within 300 feet of an existing batch plant. And then some of the suggestions, of course, were, to start with distance requirements of maybe what TCEQ requires at 440 yards if a municipality doesn't have their own zoning regulations. That was said to be maybe a good place to start, and then build on that from there. And then at least quarter mile might be appropriate. TCQ dictates 20 feet from residential uses. No batch plants allowed to locate side by side. Where 50-foot minimum distance is also a distance for other industrial uses such as oil and gas, so might be an appropriate distance. And similar, we heard distance requirements should be part of the zoning process as determined with an SUP. And then maybe a cap on the number of batch plants per residential area or minimum distance between existing and new facilities. And we also did hear that the 1,500-foot distance that kept coming up as a possible appropriate distance is arbitrary and should not be predetermined, would prohibit most batch plants, and would put most concrete trucks on the road, contributing to more emissions and traffic. So what staff is recommending is minimum distances from residential structure and or residential district, a public school or a public park, and from another batch plant for permanent and temporary offsite only would be the distance between the two batch plants. And I'll break that down. But for a permanent batch plant, that would be a concrete or asphalt type of a batch plant. We're recommending 1,640 feet from any of those sensitive uses. Again, that would be from a residential structure, residential district, a public park or a public school, or from another batch plant in this case. And I'll explain in just a minute where the distances are coming from, but I'll continue. And then also for a permanent batch plant, for an alternative green concrete batch plant, that is a new category or subcategory, if you will, of a batch plant, we're recommending a 1,320-foot distance between both the sensitive land uses and between each other. And then a concrete or asphalt recycling, a permanent concrete or recycling batch plant, we're recommending 3,281 feet from both sensitive land uses and between the uses. For the temporary batch plants, we're recommending the 1,640 foot from both, meaning, between the sensitive land uses and between each other, if they're an off-site temporary batch plant. If a temporary batch plant is on site, meaning it's located on the construction site that it's intending to serve, we're recommending 330 feet from the sensitive land uses, but none from each other, because, again, that's to serve a particular development for a short period of time. It's not permanent. And then also the same distance if it's in the right of way. For the alternative green concrete batch plant, for temporary off-site, same distance as the permanent, basically 1,640 feet with distances from the sensitive land uses and each other. And then 330 feet, of course, if it's on site serving that development or in the right of way. And then, of course, we don't have a temporary concrete or asphalt recycling category. It's just a permanent. So the distances are being recommended were found from their guidance. They come from the guidance of the assessment of environmental factors for sensitive industrial land uses with respect to sensitive land uses. And that's coming from the EPA 1986 Act, EPA Environmental Protection Act of 1986 as amended. It's been amended over time. So that's where the recommended distances are coming from. And those are based on some risk factors and other factors that studies that EPA has conducted over the years. Some other issues that we heard were equity issues. Again, large concentrations of batch plants in Black and brown communities, and that West Dallas has a lot of the batch plants. They've got a lot of environmental issues and pollution because there's a heavy concentration of the batch plants there. And suggestions were batch plants should not be allowed in residential neighborhoods. No batch plants allowed to locate side by side, because again, the concern is the cumulative impacts of a heavy concentration of batch plants in one location with respect to emissions. So and then separate batch plants from residential uses, not just areas zoned for residential. So permanent batch plants, again, in our recommendations, permanent batch plants are no longer allowed in IR Industrial Research District. Right now, currently in our code, before we did phase one, we had permanent batch plants had the ability to apply for a specific use permit in either an IM district or an IR district. So now permanent batch plants only would be allowed in the IM district with an approved SUP and with additional provisions. Oh, I'm so sorry. Keyboard sensitive, I'm sorry. Okay, permanent batch plants only allowed in, again, IM district with an approved SUP. Temporary batch plants are only allowed in residential districts when serving the residential construction or partial reconstruction and with an SUP if it's a temporary offsite. Distances minimum from residential structure in or public school park and from another batch plant. Again, that's just a repeat of what we went over, but those are intended to help address some of the equity issues. There is a lot of IR industrial research zoning that is heavily concentrated in some of these communities, particularly West Dallas, Council District 6. They have, of course, it's in some others too, but it's heavily concentrated there. So, that will help to some degree with the zoning. We did hear that the city has allowed the batch plant uses through zoning and land use, our comprehensive land use, to locate mainly in Black and brown communities. So suggestions we had was that appropriate areas need to be addressed through Forward Dallas, which is our comprehensive planning amendment, of course, and then to update the zoning. And of course, we heard don't hesitate to rezone. That's separate from our zoning code. And so what this is that we're talking about is a code amendment for our development code or zoning, our zoning regulations. So, Forward Dallas is separate, and I believe that we're undergoing the Forward Dallas rewrite or amendment right now, and I know they've heard that input, about the land use, and there may be some changes in that, certainly, but that's not under the purview of this code amendment. So I did want to address that. TCEQ and city regulations. We heard that TCEQ cannot consider a concentration of batch plants in particulate matter. And yes, again, that's what that's talking about or referring to is the accumulation of air emissions, because we have some batch plants that are close together. We have some that are actually on the same overall property. There's 3 of them on one large piece of property, because TCEQ defines site a little bit differently than we do. And it's my understanding that their definition of a site is just under the same ownership or operator. So they're allowed to have, 2 or 3 batch plants on one overall property. So that is correct in saying they can't consider that. And then they're in their modeling right now, they don't consider the cumulative impacts. And I will talk more in that a little further, but TCQ standards are not strict. And then suggestions were no batch plants allowed to locate side by side, maybe cap or put a minimum distance. So that's mainly what we heard. So staff recommendations are no more than 1 batch plant allowed on a site area or a lot area. And of course, ours definition is different. That's one piece of property, defined by its legal description, basically. Distance requirements between the permanent and temporary offsite batch plants. Of course, we have that spacing. Our distance requirements, basically what we're recommending, we have a minimum of 1,320 feet for permanent batch plants, and that's the green concrete, the alternative paving type only. And then otherwise we have 1,640 feet for permanent batch plants, and the 3,281 feet for concrete and asphalt recycling. So I just wanted to kind of recap that. And then also on same subject, the TCQ and city regs, we're hearing that concrete material and the materials need to be close to the projects they serve, of course. Batch plants have already been studied by TCEQ. Regulations by the municipality are duplicative and confusing with TCEQ regulations. TCEQ has oversight based on modeling. The 440 yards was established by TCEQ when a city doesn't have their own regulations or not based on scientific data. And then phase 1 requirements are onerous for temporary batch plants. The timing is of the essence, of course, and there's potential for construction delays. It's not our intent at all. That's why, we have made this a priority to get phase 2 moving forward quickly. So a suggestion is in that vein was that TCEQ should be the main regulator. Staff recommendations. temporary batch plans are allowed on-site, off-site, and in the right of way with provisions. So I think, that helps give a lot of different opportunities for, for these, for there not to be a time delay, because if they can meet all of the provisions, the temporary plants can meet all of the provisions, they can actually go in by right. Distance requirements are based on the EPA Act of 86 as amended. Again, that guidance is based on data that they've had and some risk factors that they put in for industrial uses and separation distance between sensitive land uses. So we feel like that's an appropriate distance, that's a good guidance, and that's why we're trying to follow that. TCEQ distance requirements for on-site equipment are the same. We're not recommending to change that, but we do have distance to property lines for our regulations based on EPA guidance. So, as we know, the state has their own regulations. City has their own regulations. That's pretty standard for any, for a lot of land uses. TCEQ is currently assessing their modeling of air contaminants under rulemaking. Some of us did attend those meetings. It seems like the focus is a little bit narrow. We don't know what will come out of that, but again, the city regulations are what we feel is best for the city of Dallas. So, we're going to move forward on ours, and that's why our recommendations for any of the TCEQ distance requirements for on-site are as amended. So whatever they amend will apply, if anything, will apply. Temporary batch plans are allowed by right in all districts except residential and special districts if all the provisions are met. So again, recap of what I said earlier, they have that opportunity to go in quickly, and by right, if they can meet all of the requirements. Now, if they're in residential or a special district, then they're going to have to go through an SUP process, or if they can't meet the provisions. On renewals, we heard quite a bit about renewals, and temporary batch plants are already allowed up to 180 days, and which they are. We did hear no definition for temporary batch plant necessarily. We do have one, but we are amending definitions through this process. But renewal process, some suggestions. Renewal process does need to provide accountability. It should run with the construction project it serves. No limited extensions. And we heard allow one extension. Temporary batch plant should have to go back every 6 months. So we heard some different ideas. So our staff recommendation for renewals, no auto renewals at all. 2 renewals per the updated construction contract or as determined by the SUP. And that's really for the temporary batch plants. Definitions for each of the temporary batch plant subcategories, including the 180-day time frame. We do have definitions. So we're not recommending renewals per se for the permanent batch plants, and that's here. Again, on the renewal issue, we heard a lot about that. What message are you sending with respect to environmental justice when you've got all these renewals and auto renewals? So we had suggestions, keep the renewals to the minimum. There were some, a lot of people didn't really care for auto renewals, but, and then there were some make it 10-year approval, but no less than 5 for the permanent batch plants. So, a lot of ideas on that, but what we're recommending for the permanent batch plants is not to have a renewal time frame. We've got a lot of elements in place, And, I'll continue to move through that, but we feel like we've got, with the distance requirements and all of the other measures, all of the other provisions, um, and the internal process and code compliance and, departmental coordination now with these, with the batch plants and compliance. Um, we feel like they're going to make a significant investment. And so we're not recommending that they have to keep coming back for a renewal unless, of course, it's imposed as part of the approved SUP because they are required to have an SUP. So that's always, of course, the purview of City Plan Commission and City Council. Air quality issues, we heard a lot about that, of course. Dust is a problem, not a lot of focus on the air quality and floodplains protection. So, we heard that that should be considered, of course. And we also heard no screening for temporary batch plants because it's not feasible. Address the cumulative impacts and the sites need to be large enough. Our recommendations. We have our land use regulations and additional provisions that are aimed, of course, at air quality. We've got the distances from the land use, sensitive land uses that it's not in here covered, but you'll see that as we go to ZOAC and CPC and City Council, but we have dust suppression measures, a lot of those. Ingress, egress, we don't want access on residential streets. Of course, there's an exception to that. If a temporary plant is serving a residential development and they don't have any other access, of course, then that would be an exception. We have screening and landscaping for permanent facilities only, the permanent batch plants. We have site restoration and remediation, for all the plants. We do have some temporary screening requirements for temporary batch plants only. We recognize that, it's not permanent. We don't, there's going to be development. They're going to have to follow whatever screening requirements are in place anyway in our ordinance. There's no need to erect a permanent structure, obviously. So greater than equal to 100 feet from a floodplain or floodway also is a requirement across the board. We are going to provide the health data as we go to ZOAC, CPC, and council that will be attached. We were asked, to provide some health information. Cumulative impacts are being addressed again with the distance requirements between the batch plants and then having only one allowed per site or area. Removing, of course, the ability to have the batch plants in the IR district as well. And then we have a minimum 1 acre site requirement that we're proposing. On the permanent batch plants, with respect to air quality issues, we heard, we need to think about the infrastructure needs to improve the areas, and that TCEQ requires a 12-foot tall fence to help capture the fugitive emissions if the stockpile is 50 feet from the property line. So yes, TCEQ does have some specific requirements that if they can't meet the distance from the equipment to the property line, they have to erect a 12-foot fence. It was suggested we consider a combination of vegetation screening. So our recommendation, of course, TCEQ requirements still apply with respect to those equipment to the property line. And so if they don't follow that, they would have to erect a 12-foot fence. But otherwise, we are recommending an 8-foot tall solid screening fence unless TCEQ requirements dictate that they have 12-foot, basically. We have landscape buffers that we're requiring 30 feet adjacent to streets, 20 feet adjacent to all other. Again, this is all permanent batch plants, not, of course, not the temporary. Then we have some trees that are to be staggered inside the screening wall and outside of the screening wall. The purpose is mainly not only for It's a little bit of it is for aesthetics, of course, but a lot of the landscaping requirement is to help clean the air because, as we know, the trees and the shrubbery helps clean the air. So we definitely want to put that in place. So as far as the infrastructure, um, paving, maneuvering, and driveways must be on a compacted subgrade and must be concrete or asphalt. A dust-proof surface, for the most part, just a solid surface. Crushed impervious surfaces are prohibited in places where vehicles are operated. That's for permanent plants and just slightly different for temporary, where it's the same except must be concrete or asphalt or a dust-proof surface, and must be maintained as such. Same thing. And again, the issue is keeping the dust to a minimum, keeping that solid surface that can be, you can control the dust and, with watering and sweeping, etc. On property notification issues, we heard we need to look at the 200-foot public notification area. It's not adequate. And we're not including the schools or the homeowner associations, etc. So we were asked to look at that, maybe increase to 400 feet for the public notification areas, and notify businesses, schools, etc. Recommendations: public notification shall be 500 feet. Of course, this is at SUPs only. Any of them going through an SUP, whether it be the temporary or the permanent, that would kick in. By right, we wouldn't do that, of course, but and then also notification to HOAs and public schools on record will be the same as the distance requirements for the respective batch plant subcategories. So again, if the plant has a 1,640-foot distance requirement, then the same would apply to the notification of the schools and the homeowners associations. We're also suggesting to the applicants to meet with nearby property owners, homeowners associations, and surrounding businesses to address concerns and incorporate into the site plan. Again, for SUPs, we all know that's vital to our public hearing process and helps everything go a lot smoother and faster and respectfully, more efficiently. Property notification issues, signs posted on the property. We didn't really hear that, but we do have some measures for signage. We want uniform signage on the property with the appropriate contacts in the event anything happens or the operator needs to be contacted. So it needs to be the person responsible. We want the SUP number if there is one, and the expiration date if there is one, per their certificate of occupancy, and then just some signage, uniform measures, make sure they're visible and legible. On compliance issues, we had some different things, clear cutting of trees, no policy changes. We had some non-compliant plants, etc. So suggestions: get operators into compliance, change policies, self-reporting checklist, need a checklist beyond TCEQ, checklist to determine compliance, etc. So on the clear cutting of trees, of course, that's not allowed with the landscape and tree preservation ordinance. So that's an enforcement issue. Again, it's not really, something that's addressed through this code amendment, but we would ask that you call 311 to report any issues. Internal coordination with applications, approvals, and non-compliance is ongoing. We've already had a lot of that, where through this research and just this process, there might be some of the plants that forgot to go back to get their inspection, after they've done everything else. So anyway, that'll continue. That's already working. Concrete or asphalt batch plants must come into compliance within 2 years from the date of ordinance or at the time of the renewal date, whichever is first. We'll need to obviously talk about this more. It'll have to be the details and everything, it'll have to be vetted out because we know we have existing plants. So we'll continue to work with our council on that and city attorneys. So we did develop a checklist for applications as part of intake. I mentioned that earlier. Our checklist will require a lot of different things to make sure that, it's a kind of a checks and balances that they are in compliance with the distance measurements. Of course, that's in our GIS system, so we'll be able to see that too. But self-reporting for violations and emissions is part of the checklist. We're requiring a copy of the TCEQ application and any SWIP application, if applicable. Any stormwater requirement, that's the stormwater requirement if they have one. We want all that information, so we're going to get a lot of information on intake. Internal interaction dashboard map, again, it's still draft, but we're nearing completion. So that'll go a long way in better record keeping and our spatial analysis. So our next steps to take the results and the draft recommendations to ZOAC on December 13th. And, whatever we have a recommendation from ZOAC, of course, we'll forward that proposal on to CPC, City Plan Commission, and then at the earliest available meeting, of course, and then that recommendation will go on to the City Council as required for final action. With that, I'd love to hear input and questions. That's why we're here. So it's just a quick overview of how to speak. You could just, raise the hand, the little hand icon, and you can, but please state your name and address for the record, and then call in attendees. Staff can call out the first 6 digits of the phone number. The host, Mike, I believe he's still the host. He's gonna unmute you, and if you change your mind, you can always say pass if you choose not to speak. So if you want to see the attendees, people are in the meeting, or to write in speak your name and address, you can do it down here where it says to host. And then if you want to see all the attendees, this is just how to do that. So sorry. Yeah, you can find it under participants and view all attendees on that side of the screen. So with that, here's our contact information. We have our webpage where you can find, all of the previous information. The public presentations, of course, will be posted. Everything, will be posted. Staff reports and everything. The previous staff reports are posted. So please contact myself or Sarah May if you have questions or if you want to forward comments. With that, do we have anyone? Okay, Mike, it looks like we have Ms. Mayo who would like to speak. Okay, Ms. Mayo.
Good morning, Evelyn Mayo, 7732 Village Trail Drive, Dallas, Texas. Thank you for the presentation. I just had 2 questions. The first is, you mentioned on the recommendations that these facilities must come into compliance within 2 years of this being adopted. By coming into compliance, let's say they don't come into compliance, would they then be deemed non-conforming or would they be deemed illegal?
It's a great question. And again, that's something that we will have to continue the conversation from our city attorney's office. How we define compliance even, compliance, I'm thinking means if they're required through this to have an SUP, then they're going to have to go through that process. And then, of course, they should try to incorporate as many as possible, even if they cannot comply with everything, then they're going to need to make their case, I guess, through the SUP process. But this all has to be vetted out. It's a great question. I don't know. I don't want to say definitively because, that's for our attorneys to, that's something we'll have to determine. It's important, and it's something that we'll have to continue to vet out. And then, that's a decision that ultimately our bodies are charged with, to determine whether they want to change that, or, it'll be a decision that'll have to be made.
Understood. Thank you.
Thank you.
My second question was for the internal interactive dashboard map for better record keeping and spatial analysis. Is that the same mapping tool that a screenshot was included in at the ZOAC meeting in September, which displays the location of temporary and permanent batch plans?
Yes, Ms. Mayo, that is the map. It is intended to continue to be used as a tool, to help us determine, as these batch plants come in, if they're in compliance, to look at the data, to see on a spatial map. And we have the distances built into the map to see, how far away they are from these other uses. And yes, it will be used. That is the same map. We been working on that further, and some of that analysis will be included by the 13th meeting, the December 13th meeting, and we'll continue that. But yes, that's
Okay.
correct.
No, I only ask because as an educator, I feel like it would be beneficial for that to be a public map that could be interacted with, publicly as
Yes.
well as internally.
Yes, and thank you for that. We've been checking on how we get that accomplished, and it sounds like, it's just a matter of some authorizations that need to occur before we can do that. So that should not be a problem.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we have anyone else?
Commissioner Young and Danny Matthews were next to sign up to speak. And we have two more with raised hands after that.
Commissioner Young?
Yes, Michael Young, City Planning Commission, District 9. My first question is this. When we approved phase 1 in March, there were predictions of a flood of SUP applications. To my knowledge, that has not occurred. In fact, I'm not aware of any that have come to the Planning Commission since then. Do you have a sense of why that's the case?
I can only speculate that, maybe they were waiting for phase 2 to see what would come out of phase 2. That's the only thing I can surmise. I mean, I really don't know. But yeah, it is a little bit surprising. But of course, phase 1 mostly impacted the temporary batch plants for the most part. So, that's probably the reason too. I think we had already mentioned upfront that the temporary batch plants would not likely continue to be required to have a specific use permit. Not in every instance, of course. It's just not feasible to hold up the development that way. So, I have to believe that, they were waiting for phase 2 because we mentioned that we didn't see every temporary batch plant being required to have an SUP.
My second question is, what is the rationale of allowing permanent batch plants by SUP in the form districts? WMU, WR, and RTN.
No, they're not allowed. That was the point, that they're not allowed there.
I think you may need to go back to one of your slides because it indicated temporary or permanent in those districts by SUP?
Well, right. What I was trying to convey, and I didn't do a good job. They're not allowed in the special districts unless they they make their case basically through an SUP. In other words,
That's what I'm
does that
not
make sense?
understanding.
Oh,
Uh,
okay. I'm
If I
sorry.
have standard multifamily zoning or retail zoning, I can't even apply for a permanent SUP. But if I'm reading
Right.
the slide correctly, in WMU, WR, and RTN, I can apply.
I think what we're trying to do, I would prefer that they not be allowed, other than I am, and not within 100 feet of a floodplain, as far as the permanent plants. And they are pedestrian friendly. I don't believe that they belong in that district. They probably could not, in all honesty, they probably could not meet the form district requirements anyway. But having said that, we just wanted to give an opportunity. Basically, when you have an SUP, they can ask for that, through an SUP, and that's kind of where we were headed. Well, let's make it to where, through the SUP process, they can ask for it. Um, I love the idea that they would not even be able to apply in those districts if.
We can revisit that at a later date. My final
Okay.
question is, when you say only one batch plant per site area or lot area, how do you define when you have one batch plant or two? Is it different operators?
I would say it's two physical plants. Um, you know,
How do I know when
you
I
have,
drive out there whether it's one physical plant or two?
well, they would have, one silo and all their equipment, and then right next to it, they would have another silo and their other equipment, similar to how you would know if there's one house or two houses on a lot. You have one building, one house, and then right next to it, you have another structure that looks like a house, even though, it may look a little bit different. Is that
Again, we can revisit that later. I don't want to
okay?
monopolize the time. Thank you.
Uh, Thank you for the questions. Thank you very much. They're great questions, Commissioner. Thank you.
Danny Matthews, 2201 Main Street, Dallas 75201. And I apologize if this was covered between 9:30 and 10. I thought the meeting started at 10. So I have two questions. One kind of piggybacks off the previous question regarding the SCPs coming into compliance. Are we considering those existing concrete or asphalt batch plants that have valid SUPs, and their time period will go beyond that 2-year compliance date?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, the thought process now is that, they would come into compliance. But again, it's really going to come down to how we determine compliance, because compliance can mean maybe they're operating under an SUP now, but their CO is expired, or they didn't get a CO, because they neglected to get an inspection and it was not caught. There's different, or they're out of compliance with TCEQ regulations. So it's really going to come down to what our parameters were allowed to, if you will, use for compliance. I think our intent with compliance here is, that they comply with the new regulations. But again, that's two different things. So, are they out of compliance with the way they're supposed to be operating now? Or are they out of compliance with the new ordinance? So again, it's really it's really going to determine, you know, in the end, at the end of the day, which direction do we want to go? How far do we want to go with compliance and what we're deeming compliance?
Okay, thank you. And final
Thank you.
question, what steps were made to contact key stakeholders, such as, drivers, construction companies, home builders, et cetera, those that, maybe aren't part of that great organization? I can't think of the acronym right now, but some of the smaller key stakeholders.
Yes, yes, ma'am. Great question. Yes, we have a very, very large list of contacts that includes all of our neighborhood associations, our chambers of commerce, our professional industries, our home builders, our restaurant association, our hotel association, all those. Then we have our TxDOT and DART, and yeah, we have a very long list. So, and also ones that signed up from the last meetings were included also in that list of contacts, that database. And then, of course, those that are signed up for our zoning ordinance advisory committees, et cetera. We got some contacts also from some other departments. So it's a huge database with a list of contacts. Those were sent out via email. And then, of course, there was social media that, that our information was put on our city website. And then also we were in contact from the last meeting. And again, for this meeting, we're meeting with a few of the industries in addition to these meetings. Again, we have those already scheduled with TxDOT and TACA, which is the Texas Aggregates and Concrete Association, to answer your question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. All right. Do we have anyone else?
I see we have Jenny Cisneros and Lori Blair with their hands up.
Hi. Okay. Hi, my name is Jenny Cisneros. I live in the Singleton United Unidos neighborhood in West Dallas, and we're also part of the Coalition for Neighborhood Self-Determination. My address is 2821 Bedford Street, Dallas, Texas, 75212. I just want to say I'm super excited about the changes for phase 2. They're going to bring much relief to people in our communities, and I'm in total support of the ordinances and policies that keep industry away from people. So I really commend you for listening to the community and incorporating all that feedback into what you have drafted today. So I just wanted to say kudos to you and your team. Thank you so much, and let me know how my neighborhood association can help y'all as I keep moving forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much. This has been such a huge help, and the community has just been fantastic and responsive, and we don't always get a lot of response and community input from our residents. So thank you so much. It's been wonderful. And if you have any questions or any additional comments or anything, please do email myself or Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
This is Lori Blair.
Hi, Commissioner. Vice Chair Blair. Hi. And Commissioner.
8. I have a couple of questions. One is in respect to the distance where you're using 1,600 feet and 1,300 feet as like your standard compliancy or your standard distance from one location to another, which is less than a mile. Was it the 1,320 feet is just a quarter of a mile? My question for staff is that enough, especially since batch plants generate a lot of dust? And is that enough space between any kind of residential use, considering dust travels and the dust does not confine itself to a location and it travels. Is that considered from an TEC, from an environmental perspective, is that considered enough space from any type of residential use to consider it still a safe place to locate a batch plant?
Thank you very much for the question. And, honestly, the distance was something that it was a struggle. It was probably one of the most complicated to try to determine, is it enough? Is it too much? And, you know, we have precedents for some of the distances, as we know, like 1,500 feet from gas drilling. And we looked at that. At the end of the day, we have to go on is, and of course we have TCEQ that's saying, 1320 is sufficient. And at the end of the day, we had to find something. So basically we searched to see what else was out there, what other recommended distances might be out there that we can use based on some studies that they had, or a good source. And that's when we found the EPA guidance. And again, it's not just for batch plants. There's a listing of industrial uses and what they are considering safe distances from the sensitive land uses. And so, in most of the instances, they were greater than the 1,500 feet, maybe not by that much, but they've taken some risk factors into consideration in some other studies. So, that's what we're using. And so I don't know. I mean, I other than, we're basing it on that, and we feel like that's a good gauge from the EPA, who has done that. We feel that that's a good gauge for us.
Okay, my next question is still a relationship with distance. In your recommendation, you're making a recommendation of 30 feet from any type of floodplain or waterway, like a creek or a creek bed or something of that nature. Again, we have a lot of creeks that are we trying to use as opportunities for palatable living. And with waterways traveling, if we have a non-compliancy issue that's dumping into the waterways, is 30 feet enough? And so I guess and when it comes down to relationship, my questions are the recommended distances enough to protect our communities, especially when the EPA Protection Act is an old act of 1986, and here in 2023, we might as well be in 2023, we have learned a whole lot of things that say that what we did back in the late 1900s wasn't sufficient enough to protect the community from environmentally hazardous things. So are we looking at the relationship of distance adequately with the recommendation you have? And I think, and after this, I have one more question.
Okay. Yes, thank you for that. Some excellent points. I do want to clarify the distance from a floodplain or floodway is greater than or equal to 100 feet. And so that's we worked with our, of course, our OEQS department and, they feel that 100 feet is the right distance, for protection of the watersheds. Of course, they have a lot of environmental, especially protections in our ordinance, with respect to pollution in our water bodies. And, uh, we definitely have that protection. I think where we saw we were lacking wasn't so much with our protection of our water integrity, because we have a lot of those protection measures in place, other than that distance, maybe. Um, the air quality was where we were lacking, and that's why, we spent a lot of time on the draft regulations for phase two for these, to try to help to mitigate that. Um, is it enough? And yes, 1986, it's been amended since 1986. So, and I apologize because I knew the date at one time, the last time it was amended, and I don't remember that now. But yeah, it's been amended over time. And, so that's a fair question, is it sufficient? And we only have so much to go on. So I would say, we're hopeful that the EPA, has that protective guidance for us. They are the Environmental Protection Agency. Beyond that, like I said, it's a struggle. It really has. It's been the distances have been a challenge, to try to come up with what's appropriate, but not too excessive.
Okay, and for my last question, and it's maybe a two-part question. It's compliancy with ordinances and how to remedy non-compliancy. When we have, whether it's a TECQ non-compliance issue, TECQ and the municipalities don't seem to communicate. They don't share information, and we don't necessarily know when anybody is out of compliancy with TECQ. So in my and then we don't necessarily know, even within the city, if we have non-compliancy issues, unless residential um, um, unless someone shares the information, because and that the fact that we're asking to self-regulate and to tell on each, well, for them to share when they're not being in compliancy is to me is an oxymoron. So my question would be, do we have staff enough when we find non-compliancy issues, to regulate and to bring into compliancy those entities that are already existing, as well as those that are coming forward to come into compliancy? And if we do, is a 2-year time limit too much time for them to be given for them to come into compliancy? Thanks.
It's a great question. I mean, I think that's been the other big issue, elephant in the room, if you will. I, you know, as far as the TCEQ compliance, I think what we're attempting to do through the regulations by codifying the TCEQ distance regulations between the equipment, that's part of it, because by codifying that into our ordinance, We no longer have to just rely on TCEQ, you know, to know, because they're not going to probably know whether or not the site complies with that. In all honesty, they're probably leaving that up to us. So that's part of it. The other part is, getting the applications from TCEQ. I know that now we're already communicating. I know OEQS is getting applications anyway from TCEQ, and we get notified as well when there's an application that at TCEQ that's in our city. We've been throughout this process, we've been starting to get those. And again, there's a lot more coordination now between, all of the departments that touch basically these applications and are involved in the process for batch plants and industrial uses. So the checklist is going to help us a lot in that, because we're going to actually ask for documentation, physical documentation of any noncompliance from TCEQ or code enforcement issues. We're going to ask for these things. So that's kind of the first part, a part of that. The second part of it, I can't tell you about the staffing levels. I think that, the city and the residents are gonna have all eyes on the facilities, and I think enforcement's going to, have a focus on this. But I can't speak to, I can't speak to how many inspectors they have, or I just can't speak to their staffing levels. But it's a great question, and it's important. As we know, the compliance part of it is huge. We can put all the regulations, that are great, and all the distance requirements that protect the sensitive land uses. But if there's not compliance, and it's all for nothing, basically, right? So thank you for the great questions. Did you have another one? I'm sorry, Vice Chair Blair, or I hope I answer that sufficiently.
I will address it when we get back to ZOAC with code as to how will they bring things into compliancy. So yes, you did address it. I really appreciate all the work that you have done on this particular matter, because it has been a challenge at best to say that we are getting where we need to be. So when we get back to ZOAC, yes, I will address it then. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And as always, you have the great questions, the hard questions, and just the great input. And yeah, I thank you. Thank you very, very much. I appreciate it. Thank you for taking the time this morning.
I don't mean to always give you guys challenges, but if I am challenge you, I'm grateful that you guys are entertaining my challenges.
They're important. It's the hard questions that need to be answered, and we have to figure it out, and we have to get it right best we can. Mike, did you have anyone else?
I've got Rita Bevin has her hand up, and Commissioner Reeves has his up. So I don't know if Ms. Bevin spoke prior or if she has another question. So Either one of y'all can unmute and start asking questions.
This is Mark Rees. I didn't have any questions, but thank you very much. This is like, I'll echo Commissioner Blair's statements there, that this is really good stuff, and much appreciate staff's work on this.
Thank you so much for spending your morning with us, Commissioner, Zoet Member Reeves. Thank you so much.
Lori, it's Rita Beving with Public Citizen. I'm also the technical advisor to the Environmental Commission. And
Hi.
I don't know any commissioner or technical person that isn't appreciative of your efforts on this. And as somebody who's been around the environmental community for over 25 years, I hope, especially since TCEQ is reviewing concrete batch plant rules as well, that we can encourage, the cities can encourage TCEQ, since Dallas has extended air authority for inspection and so forth, that the city asks TCEQ for better training and better communication with cities on doing enforcement and inspection, and that it would be great to ask for better notification from TCEQ on when these permits are applied for. I just wanted to bring that up since Ms. Blair had some questions. It just prompted me to think about that one of the prior OEQS directors mentioned to me that he wished that they had better training and notification by TCEQ so they could better do their job. So just wanted to mention that, and thanks again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I couldn't agree more. And I know throughout this process, we also were fortunate to be able to speak with some TCEQ representatives through our chairwoman, Bazan, who was able to get that set up for us and get us in touch with some of the TCEQ folks that kind of gave us some input on where they saw shortcomings. So they're aware of the shortcomings, or at least some of them are aware of the shortcomings in their regulations. And I kind of get the sense that they feel like their hands are tied, to some extent. So, I feel like too, through the, I know that several of the commissioners and staff members, and myself included, attended the TCEQ rulemaking session and asked a lot of questions, and I and Chairwoman Bazan was also as we know, just integral in giving input with TCEQ, and I feel like they know that Dallas is very, it's very important to us. And, I just feel like, at least with that presence, they know how very, very important this is for us. And so I'm just hopeful that we can continue that coordination with them, and, hopeful that, something much more substantive comes out of their rulemaking with respect with the air modeling and just everything else that we shared.
Well, Lori, I just want to share this, and for those that are still on the phone, at the last legislative session, Harris County, Fort Worth, El Paso, there are a lot of cities fed up with how concrete batch plants have operated in their cities. And what we can't get done through the TCEQ new rules, or I'm so grateful for our city taking this stand. We may need to pursue some things legislatively, and our organization is willing to work on that with you.
Great. Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for everything that you do and all of your great input. And I know you were on last night or yesterday evening with us and had, just great feedback and questions. And thank you so much for taking the time again this morning to be with us. Mike?
That's it, Lori. You can wrap it up now.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for taking your time out of your day. I know everyone's busy, but thank you so much for joining us. We really, really appreciate the comments and the questions. Don't hesitate to reach out to myself. Like I said, send me an email if something comes up. Also, we do have the meeting on Saturday. And so that'll be just this Saturday, December 3rd, from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. And that session will have Spanish language interpretation as well as the presentation will be in Spanish and English. So thank you. We look forward to continuing to work with everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.